Welcome. I'm David Jensen. I'm the technical director for University Theater.
I'm Mike White. I'm the assistant technical director for productions for University Theater.
Today, we are going to be doing part 2 of Power Tools. We're going to be talking about the table saw and the chop saws, the crosscut saws. So these are probably the workhorses of the scene shop. They're the ones that are on most of the time and just kind of ripping, cutting, and getting things ready for us to build. So they're the most important saws to us in this shop. So what we're going to talk about just real quick is what are the two differences between table saw and some crosscut saws. So the table saw is considered to be a rip saw, where you are ripping wood along the long edge. So where a crosscut saw, you're cutting across. And actually, Kevin, can you just go ahead and pan over there just real quick so we can see the crosscut saws over there. So you can see those saws over there, and they've got that long fence running all the way down that table. So that's where we always want the long edge of our wood or material to be. So the table saw has the fence that's running along here. And the blade is there. So the blade and the fence are parallel to each other. So that's kind of ripping it along the long edge. Where the crosscut, like I said, you're cutting across the grain or across the short edge. Let's see. So I think those are pretty much the big differences. We're going to come back to all that stuff. But first, we're going to talk about the type of saw this is, which is a saw-stop saw, which is a particular brand. And we're going to have Mike talk about that.
Yeah, so the saw-stop is a specific brand of table saws that has a mechanism in it that's for safety. So what it does is anytime that your hand will get close to the saw blade, the saw will recognize it and it will prevent accidents before they happen. Essentially, what it does is it will launch a break into the blade, causing the blade to fall below the surface. It has an electrical current inside of the blade that will tell it if anybody or anything that can cause harm getting close to it is near it or not. So the way that you recognize it that it's working with the saw stop is there is a small light here that is for function. And so whenever any type of wood or anything that doesn't have any type of electrical current running through it, it doesn't set it off or anything. So I can just run this pencil, which is wood, on it at any time, or even the metal, because it doesn't conduct and it doesn't complete the circuit. But anytime that I even get my finger, touch it, it'll set it off. It's the smallest little touch will set it off. What it looks like, and we'll show a video of it in a minute, is this is a blade and a brake after having been essentially disposed of. So it has this brake section that fits underneath the table saw that will, and the spring, so whenever it conducts and it does a check to conduct electricity through it, it will launch the spring and this brake into the blade as the blade spins, which will cause the blade to drop down in several microseconds before your hand gets anywhere near it. And so basically causing it to be safe for anybody. And the most you'll get is a small nick. We use these in our shop and a lot of educational circumstances because they are the safest and the best for learning. Do you want to show them?
I'm going to show the video in just a second, but actually, just real quick. So what Mike was talking about with the pencil. So the metal band on the pencil does conduct, but what they tried to do is they tried to get it so it recognizes enough of a draw. So of course the metal is going to conduct, but there's not enough there to draw. So as soon as I put my finger on top of that, then it's going to detect my finger, and now it should be flashing. Is it flashing?
It is.
So they tried to get it so if you run into, I'll do it again. So there's the pencil touching it, and then I'm just going to touch the metal band around the eraser, and you can see that it's activating. So it's detecting more of a draw. It's not just going to detect that. So then that way they're trying to prevent it from just going off on small staples or nails and stuff like that and destroying the brake for something that, you know, isn't your finger. So they tried to build in some smart technology, but there are other things that have set it off that we've had before, such as mirrored plexiglass.
The film on pink foam can set it off.
Sometimes, right, the static charge.
Wet lumber.
Wet lumber, if it's raining outside, you bring in wet lumber. Or if some of your wood has been glued together and maybe the glue isn't dry yet, it will detect the moisture.
So it's not foolproof.
Exactly.
But it is safe.
It's about $70 for a new brake, and then it's another $100 for a blade. So it's an expensive change, but your fingers is worth it. So it's a good thing to have. And we're gonna take a look. I'm gonna share some video of the saw stop. So you can see in this video, they kind of use a hot dog to demonstrate a finger. So you can see, as soon as it hits it, it detects. And here's what the brake looks like right behind the blade. And there's a charge in there. I believe this video is actually the owner of SawStop. You can see it just nicked his finger, and it sets off that charge just like in an airbag, and it rams that brake, which then just kind of crumples. And when that does hit, it's going to do some damage to that saw blade. So do not try to pry that off and try to reuse that blade, because that blade has now been compromised. You don't want teeth flying off, but it does not hurt the saw itself. And you just change out the brake, pop it back in just like that, put on a new blade, and you're ready to go. So it's great technology. It's something that's probably saved a lot of fingers. So we're going to keep on going on the table saw. So we're going to talk about the fence. So again, the fence on the table saw is your friend. As long as you are staying up against the fence, then you'll be running parallel to that blade. As long as you're running parallel to that blade, you're just going to go right past it. We always kind of have to think about a lot of these tools like the wheels that they are. The blade is spinning this way, so it's going to want to throw things that way. You kind of have to think of it kind of like a baseball pitching machine. You've got this wheel running. All of this area right here is just kind of making surface contact with this. And there's friction, so it's kind of wanting to throw it that way. As long as you are staying up against the fence, then the blade's just going to be spinning past it. If you come off that fence and you start rubbing into the side of the blade, that's when it could kind of kick back at you. And they do have some safeties to try to prevent kickbacks, and Mike will talk about that in a little bit. So the fence is set up with this little cursor right here and a tape that runs all along here. So that measurement, if I set it on 1 foot and I lock it down with the handle right here, then it's going to be 1 foot from here to this side of the blade. So what you get is 1 foot. And I always talk about the table saw this way because you can see it better this way, but you never want to be on this side. You always want to be on this side so you can see the fence. Right now, I can't see if that wood is up against the fence. You always want to be over on this side because that's what you're kind of concentrating on. You're looking at your piece of wood up against the fence as it goes by. Let me go back to the crosscut because I kind of jumped over this real quick. So I said that the table saw is a rip saw. You can use it as a crosscut saw, but we don't do it that often because most of the time we're cutting really big pieces of wood, and we're not going to try to do crosscuts with this. You can, though, do smaller pieces of wood, and you can use guides, such as this one, to be able to run through to be able to cut. So now this becomes your fence. Or that's kind of the kind that comes with it. Or you can get nicer ones so you can have some different angles and whatnot. So this can be a crosscut saw, but for the most part, it's a rip saw. But again, you've got this nice long fence. So you're running your long piece of wood up against the fence. But again, we're making walls that are 16 foot tall. So we're cutting pieces of wood that are 16 foot long. We are not going to want to try to get something through the table saw that's hanging off that far, which is why we have the chop saws. So how to feed the material through? Again, you always want to be on the left side of the saw. So you can see the wood as it's going along the fence. And you're always going to feed it in a hand over hand motion, never letting go, because that's when you get in danger of it coming back at you. Also, the other reason why you want to stand to the left, because if it does come kick back at you, it's going to want to go this way. So you want to get out of the way until the very end. Once you're at the very end, you kind of have to follow right behind it to push it through. Anytime we get into this red zone, that's our danger zone. That's when we want to use something like this, which is a push stick. We have lots of different kinds of push sticks, depending on what you're doing. So these are fairly similar. You can see it's got a notch right there. So it just kind of locks onto the wood. This one's same thing, that way or that way. Nice to be able to have two around in case you're cutting small pieces. You can always just kind of push the wood away here with another one. Some people like to build their own push sticks. This one's good because it gets a little more surface area on there. And they also make this kind too. Again, it's got just a little bit of a notch there. I like this one because it really does get your hand up high over the blade. And if you will notice, these are all plastic or wood. So in case you do hit the blade with one of these, it's just going to cut right through. A screwdriver or a chisel is not a good idea for a push stick. You want it to be sacrificial. So that's the big thing, is just staying up against the fence, running parallel. As long as you're parallel to the blade, then you're good.
There's a question.
It depends. As you can see, we have a large runoff table here. So if I'm running long pieces of wood, then it just runs off onto the table. What's nice is to be able to have someone, if you're doing repeated, numerous cuts, you can have someone just kind of catch those after you cut through. So they can just kind of take it, you can grab the next piece and feed through. Other times, if you're doing another cut, where if you're cutting the large sheet goods maybe, and you've got something hanging over, again, we've got our other shop tables that are the same height as the table saw for a reason, so it can sit on that and be supported. But it is nice to be able to have someone to help scoot it along. Actually, as I was doing that motion, so when you are cutting, the big thing that you want to remember too is you want to make sure when you're pushing that through that you clear past the blade. So if you're cutting, if you get up to this point, you're going to have cut through the piece of wood. But you need to make sure that you keep going past the blade, because otherwise you're still kind of sitting in that danger zone where it could throw it back at you. So I think that's everything for the fence.
So next is we're going to now that we talked about the dangers, we'll talk about the safeties of the saw. So these saws, because they're used so much and by so many different varieties of people, they have a lot of different safety concerns. The biggest thing in our shop is safety. So you're going to hear it a lot if you ever come in here, or if you ever watch any of these videos, it's a lot of safety and safety things. So with using the table saw, and anytime you cut wood, you want to make sure to use safety glasses to prevent anything from getting in your face or in your eyes. If you're using the table saw for long periods of time, you'll also want to consider hearing protection, so that you are safe. Like Dave said before, there's the red zone on the saw, so you don't want to put your fingers inside of it. It's there to make sure that you remember, and it's a bright color to make sure that you don't get anywhere near it, because the saw will not stop for you. These are a little bit of an exception because they are the saw stops, so they're made to do that, but it's a $200 replacement every time it happens. So we try not to. Into other safeties of the saw itself, we have a dust collection, which I'll get into in a minute, associated with the saw. So it's anything about managing the amount of dust and the dust flow in the air and everything with it. So there is this guard here on top that keeps your fingers from being near the blade, that lifts up for your material, but also has the ability to suck dust in and keep it close to the table. You have another part of the guard here that will basically tell you the approximate height of your blade, so that you don't actually have to get near your blade, so that you know if you're pushing something tall, it won't be able to actually cut all the way through your material. Whereas if you're pushing something like a 1x, it'll clear easily with this current height. In the backs, there are several different mechanisms involved with preventing kickback. On this saw, there is the splitter here in the back, which is essentially there to keep your wood from binding. So when you're cutting a lot of natural grain wood, the grains aren't straight. So as you're cutting through it, sometimes they want to split apart or they want to push together. So what the splitter does is it prevents the wood from pinching the blade and binding the blade or causing kickback. Another thing that it has in it are these little feet. These little feet, there are two sets of these small feet here. So you can see these small ones here, and then these larger ones on the outside. So what they do is they have these teeth in them that are here to bite into the wood to prevent it from pulling back into kicking back. So if you push your material in, it'll ride along it, but as soon as you try to pull it back, it will bite into the wood and prevent it as much as possible from pulling back. So you have to continue through or stop the saw and pick it up. So yeah, so make sure that your fingers are away from the blade, that your hair is tied back if you have long hair, that you don't have dangly jewelry or clothing, anything that can get caught up in the blade, because it can be very detrimental to you and to it. We also have, as I said before, we have a dust collector system involved in this saw and the other saws. This one has its own individual one with its placement in the shop. So it has a hose that comes out of the back of the blade that's attached to this guard. It runs back into our dust collector over here. It's just a vacuum collector with a bag that we empty every once in a while. There is also another hose that connects into the bottom of the saw stop that collects all the dust that falls into the machine. We like to use it as much as possible because these create a lot of dust and a lot of debris. So keeping it safe and clean is always better. I believe that is essentially most of dust collector. Yeah.
So just to go back to one thing I forgot to mention, as you are ripping, I kind of mentioned it before, as you're ripping, as you are cutting through this wood, you don't have to worry much about the piece that's on the other side. So it's just going to be hanging along this piece, and when it gets cut off, it's just going to kind of drop off to the side. This is the piece that you'll always want to hang on to, never let go of. That piece, again, will just kind of fall off, or like I said, you can take a push stick and just push it out of the way. Some of the other controls on the table saw is the height. So depending on what you're cutting, you may need more blade or less, but it's always a good rule that you only need as much blade you only need the teeth to be just above your work for a couple reasons. So it is cutting down on the amount of surface area that could be friction, which could cause the kickback, and also to reduce the hazard of the blade. You don't need that much blade to cut through something like that. If your hand does come into contact, it's better to have as least of the blade as possible exposed. So the height adjusts easily like that. You can also, and I'll just raise this up so it's easier to see. You can also adjust the angle so it will go over to 45 degrees. What's nice about this table saw is that it's got the fence will also be able to go to the other side. So if you're cutting something, but you want the angle to go the other way, you can move the fence over, which is why it also has the indicator on this side. So there's also a tape over on this side, so you can get the measurement over there. Anytime that you change out a blade, the thickness of the blade may vary. So you always want to adjust that to take into account the thickness of your blade. So we're gonna set this back up. I think that's it.
Yeah. So next we'll do a demonstration for you guys on how to properly use the table saw. I'm going to use a piece of Luan that we have. It's a 2 foot by 3.5 feet. I'm going to, so when you're doing it and you're cutting either sheet goods or your material, you want to make sure that your guard is at the right position. As Dave said before, and I'm just going to reiterate a couple things, is make sure that the area that you want for the size of your material is the distance between the fence and the side of the blade that's closer to the fence, because that is what your remainder will be. The rest of it doesn't matter as much. So I'm going to set this to a foot, making sure I'm using the correct indicator on my distance here. Make sure your whole area is clear so that it won't prevent you from cutting. Go a little bit lower because why not? Lock it down. Lock this down. So the on-off button is this large switch. It's this large, so anytime you need to hit it when you don't have hands, you can use your knee or any other body part, and it's always a push in to stop, so that it is safer than having to pull or do another type of action. So to start it, you'll just pull it straight out, and then it'll start. It's just a small little tap. The small one is the full main functions and the power to the saw. So I'll turn on the vacuum, and then the saw, and then I'll align myself with my fence, and then push my material through, making sure my hands are out of the way. I'm going to cut this along with the grain of this material. Manufactured materials like Luan or plywood are a little different than natural grain woods in the rules of cutting, ripping or cross-cutting. But I'm going to follow this grain just to do a rip saw, a rip cut. So if we can mute, and I will, okay. So just beware of your ears. For everybody listening, you may want to mute your audio. It's kind of loud.
Like,
yeah. And so you can see that I pushed all the way through the material and through the saw to make sure that it's clear and there's nothing touching the blade. And then I'll stop the saw and everything else, and then move on. And now I have this piece of Luan that is 1 foot wide. I think that is most of the table saw. And so, anything else?
I think that was it. I mean, again, it's always, the motion is hand over hand, over hand, over hand, just feeding it through nice and smooth until you're all the way done. We have a runoff table here for the wood, but we also have a table that's located right behind it too for those really long pieces. Then again, if you don't have someone else here to help you, you've got your wood supported back behind you. So all you are doing is just feeding the machine.
And on the saw, we cut anything from plywood to natural grain lumber to plexiglass to foam. A lot of different materials get cut on this saw.
Sure, and you can actually probably see it right there in the shot is we've got a bunch of foam back there. Foam is one of the more difficult things to cut because it is so sticky. It really likes to grab hold of the side of the blade and it will throw back at you really quick. This is not very forgiving. Whereas wood is a little denser. The foam is soft and sticky, and if it hits the side, it's going to want to come back at you. But yeah, the table saw is again the biggest workhorse in here. And then after we're done cutting, ripping the wood, then we bring it over here to the chop saws. And we've got a couple, or some people use chop saw because it just kind of has that chopping motion. They are crosscut saws or miter saws. We've got a couple different ones over here. So we've got these two miter saws, and then we've got these two radial arm saws. Again, these are crosscut saws. You can see probably a little bit better now. We've got this long fence that runs all the way down here. The long edge of the wood goes up against the fence. So we'll start with this one here. This is a 12-inch dual bevel glide miter saw. So it's a 12-inch blade. It's a dual bevel, which means if you unlock here, it will go over this way for a bevel, or it can go all the way over this way. You've got a control here and a lock there, so you can move it over and then lock it into position. You also have the miter control, which is controlled here. So this saw is nice because it goes all the way out to 60 degrees, where most saws go to 48 degrees, just a little bit past 45 degrees. So it goes out to 60 degrees that way, and it will go over to 52 degrees that way. And the other really nice thing about this is the glide action. So it comes out to be able to get much longer pieces of wood. There's some saws that ride on rails, but this one has this nice arm that gives it that glide motion, and it's just a really smooth cut. What else was I going to say? The miter, so it has some common indents here, so it locks into position at places like 45 degrees, that's a common one, 22.5 degrees, 15 degrees. So it locks into those, or you can take that up and then it's not going to lock in. And if you want to set it to, say, 9 degrees, you set it, twist this, and now it's locked into position. And now it's back to 0. And again, I'll just do the bevel. So the bevel, again, it's over on this side. I'll do it over on this side so you can see it. You can set that indicator, lock it into position, and now it's at 15 degrees. What's a lot of fun is when you get into compound angles, when you're doing bevels and miters combined. So some of the motion for this, actually, Mike is going to do a demonstration for this. So the biggest thing, again, is staying up against your fence. You want to stay up against the fence and down on the table. If you're away from your fence, then you have to think of that like a wheel again. It's spinning that way. It's going to want to throw the wood that way. So as long as you're up against your fence, it's just going to push it up against that. You also have to think of this like a wheel, is if it binds, that wheel is going to want to jump back at you. So you never want to be right behind that saw. You kind of want to have it here so it goes past your body. Which is why we have a blade guard here. So it kind of helps prevent some of those accidents from happening. Hopefully, it will snap back into position in time. So where you want to hold it is off to the side and then up here. You never want to do anything where you are cutting this way. You do not want to cross the path of the saw. So you're either on this side with a hand over here and a hand up here, or you've got your other hand here and your other hand here holding it down. Bosch has these little no hands here because they don't think you should be within 6 inches of the blade. They want your hands out here. Let's see. Another thing that is nice about this saw is you can set it for the depth that you want to cut. So in case you are scoring something, cutting grooves into it, it will lock into position so you can make multiple cuts like that. And that's pretty much all the functions of it. I'll leave that for Mike, and I will let him do a demonstration.
So we're going to talk about marking your wood for cutting with your crosscut saws first, and then I'll show you a demonstration on how to use it. So I've got my tape measure and my pencil in my pocket. So I'm going to cut this piece of wood. Let's do 16 inches. Why not? So take out my tape measure, attach it to the end of the piece that you want to use, and then mark it at your length. We'll do 16 inches. Do a little small tick mark, making sure that my tape measure is near the end so that I know it's as accurate as possible. And then I'll take my speed square to make sure that I have a nice straight cut. And I'll line it up with it, and I'll mark the whole thing. That's so that I can tell that I have a nice straight cut on it, and I know that I'm cutting in the right place. For the miter saw, when cutting it, a lot of people tend to want to put the wood in your line straight on top of, cut right through your line. You don't want to do that, because what's going to happen is you're going to lose a 1/16 of an inch. And then if you're cutting a lot of pieces in a row, a 1/16 plus a 1/16 plus a 1/16 can eventually add up to a lot of lost ground and lost material. So you want to always cut one, you always want to mark from one end, one at a time, so that you won't lose the material as you cut. So if you marked a whole bunch of lines saying that you want 3-inch cuts, and then you just cut them, eventually your last piece will be 1 inch and 7/8, depending on how many you do. So what that is that's called the kerf. The kerf of the blade is the thickness of the blade and the amount basically that's wasted when you cut. So what you want to do instead is you want to line your blade up on the side of the line that you're not using. So say I'm using this part, this side that I marked. So I marked from this end, which means I'm using this side. So I will mark with an X on the side I'm not using. So then I will line up my blade on the side of the line that I'm not using, so that I'm cutting off from my remainder, not from the piece that I want. So once I've done that, I'll line it up with it, make sure I pull it all the way out to make sure that I'm where I actually marked. Good. Make sure it's all the way against the fence. Safety. So safety glasses, if you're using it for a long period of time, hearing protection. Make sure I'm at the right angle and bevel that I need. And then be warned, I'll tell you when I'm going to start, but be warned, it'll be a loud saw, so you may want to mute yourself. So what I'll do is I'll get my hand outside of the area, come all the way down, come forward and down through my material, and then cut back so that I'm not trying to push the material towards me. So I'll come out, down, and then back. So start safety and then your trigger are here. So I'll make sure that I'm nice and lined up, and then I'm going to cut. So that's all the way through it. And I have a nice piece that is 16 inches long now. We also have a dust collection system for these tools that run along and go over to a whole dust collector over there. And so it's a pretty simple saw to use, and it is the workhorse of everything that we do. Next, I think we're moving on to the.
Actually, I'm going to talk just
about one more thing.
a couple more things, just because we're right here. So the dust collector, like you mentioned, we've got a remote control, so we can bring it to whichever saw that we're using, and it will turn it on down there. So each saw is connected with a gate right here. So you open up whichever saw that you're using. So then that way it's not just drawing from all four of them at the same time. You can really kind of concentrate the dust collector to pull just from this saw. Try and keep it clean. So we've got a hose that's hooked up to the top, but then there's also a collection pan in the back to try to catch some of that dust that's gonna, of course, kick out the back. There was something else that I feel like we jumped over. Oh, one of the safety concerns. So Mike was talking about, you have a button here. So it's on this side or that side. So you can push in with your thumb this way or this way. You never want to keep your handle, your hand on the trigger, because I've had these buttons stick before. So if you pull down the trigger, it's just going to run. So never get used to just holding on to that. Always keep your hand off the trigger until you know that you're ready. The other thing is, when you are about to cut, this is what happens sometimes, is when you start it, it kicks a little bit, and it may kick into the wood. And if it kicks into the wood, it's going to act like that wheel and jump at you. So whenever you're, after you line it up, you always want to back away a good distance. So then that way, when you start it up, you're not going to run the risk of it catching the wood and running at you. I think that's it.
Yeah.
All right. We're going to go over to the next saw, which is the radial arm saw. The big difference between these two saws is the amount of setup time that it takes to get this saw set. What we mainly use this saw for is doing just 90-degree cuts coming across. That saw over there, you saw, quickly adjusts for bevels and miters and stuff. This saw will do all of the same things, but it just takes a lot longer to get there. Advantages of this saw: it does come out much further. It comes out about 24 inches, 25 inches. The other thing that's great is that when you turn it on, it stays on, kind of like your table saw, so it's constantly running. Where the miter saw, you're just pulling that trigger over and over and over, and you can wear that trigger out. So this one, you can turn it on. Say if you've got a show where you need 96 legs and you're cutting all those, it's easier to set up a jig on this one. And we'll talk about a jig in just a little bit. Actually, why don't I talk about a jig right now? So Mike cut a piece at 16 inches. So I'm just going to kind of do this the quick way. So if we figure out where that needs to go, then we can use a jig block to clamp to our fence And because it's glue on, we have to kind of go this way. And then that way, you're just bumping up against your jig block every time. And you're not having to measure over and over. Because again, if you need 96 legs for a show, you're not going to want to measure 96 pieces of wood. This jig block has notches on the ends because of the sawdust. So if you've got sawdust all over your table, as that is getting pushed up against your jig block, it can push the wood away. But with the notch, hopefully, usually it's set up like this, that sawdust will go underneath and get pushed out of the way. So jig blocks get used a lot with this saw because, again, we turn it on and we're doing numerous cuts over and over. So this saw will do all of the other things that that saw will do. I'm just going to pull it out into the locked position. Let's clamp that down. It just takes, like I said, a lot longer to get there. So you can see that the saw cuts into the table here. If I want to do a miter, then I need to raise it out of that groove, pull this lock, and now it will do our miters. And this will go all the way over to 90. So it will do extreme miters, which is nice. It comes in very handy. Get that locked back in. It will, Mike, I think you're gonna have to help me with this. Also do, let me adjust this a little bit more so you can see it. It's a little sticky. It will do bevels too. Okay, I'm gonna pull this. So you can see, again, on the front, it will go 90 degrees this way, 90 degrees that way. So it will do bevels going this way. So again, you have to raise the saw up, set that bevel, turn it on, run it into your table, and then you can cut your wood. What we do a lot of times, though, is we just do a sacrificial table and fence, and that way we're not tearing up the fence that's back here whenever we're doing special cuts like that. The other thing, I'm gonna need to move it, this saw can do is turn into a table saw. So it will pivot like that. So now I can set it using this as my fence over to the blade. Figure out the measurement, lock it in. And now I'm using this as a table saw. It's not a very good table saw because it's kicking all of that dust into your face. And it's no fun, but it can be done. What's especially nice is because it can do those extreme bevels. It can go beyond the 45 degrees that the saw stop can do over there. So it does come in handy sometimes, but I don't recommend doing it a lot. So I'm gonna lower this back down. Was that everything on the list? I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
And then Mike will do a demonstration.
Yep. Absolutely. So it works very, very similarly to a chop saw. The only major difference in cutting is that rather than coming down and pushing through, you're actually pulling through it at you. So there's more force coming towards you rather than pushing away from you. So always with safety, always, always, always safety. For this one, I'm going to do a small tick mark. Let's do 12 inches this time. Get my pencil. I'm gonna do my little tick mark here. I'm gonna mark it on the further away side from me because that's the first place that the blade is gonna hit. So I'm going to mark my wood. Get myself a nice line. And then same thing with this blade as it was with the miter saw, is that you always want to keep your hands away from it, from the blade, and hold it flat against the table and against the fence. Your handle is this handle over here. It is not this guide. These can be lowered to help guide you. But it is not your guide. So what we'll do is we will bring it forward and make sure that it touches slightly. Just touch it up slightly to it to make sure that you're on your mark. And that looks about right. Don't always trust the holes in the fence because it's not always right. So you always want to check where your actual blade is. What we're going to do is hold it down, pull all the way through your lumber, and then push all the way back, making sure that it clears the fence before you do anything else. Fingers are out of the way of it. And so we will do it. You want to make sure to keep your fingers out of this safety area, just so in case the blade does anything. So I'm going to do it. So you probably will want to mute yourself because this one is very loud. So this one takes an extra second longer to stop because it spins at a higher RPM. A safety thing for all of these saws is it's very common to get splinters with this wood. But that is dealable. A lot of people like to think about, well, why don't I wear gloves? Gloves are very, very dangerous to wear when it comes to saws and spinning blades because you don't have the ability to touch the material and feel where your hands are. And so if the glove gets anywhere close, it can catch in the blade and pull your whole hand into it. So you always want to make sure that you can feel what you're doing. There are a couple exceptions to several rules, but it's always about safety and making sure that your hands and your body are safe and you won't lose anything. So no gloves. Sometimes you just have to deal with the splinter. There are lots of ways of getting those out. And this saw is very good for repetition. So where the miter saw between every single cut has to stop and then start and then stop and then start, it wears down your motor significantly, whereas the radial arm saw can be turned on and left on, so you can do a whole lot of cuts. If you're doing a lot of one cut over and over and over and over and over again, you just leave it on, let it running, make sure it's past your fence, and then line up and just go. Just always, always, always make sure you're alert and you know what you're doing, because when you start doing hundreds of the same cut, your brain starts to wander. You want to make sure you are alert and knowing exactly what you're doing with it.
And Mike already said it, but that's another good point to bring up, because you are doing the same cut over and over and over. You start to get a little lazy, and you don't always make sure that saw is all the way back. You need to make sure that it's all the way back and it's not kind of hanging out there, because again, you have to think of this like a wheel. If you bump something up against that, that wheel is now going to want to grab it and run at you. So always make sure that it's pushed all the way back. I'm going to go back to the chop saws just real quick because I forgot to show this one thing. When we're talking about the jig blocks, they have these guys here, which I showed you a quick grip on there, but you can also set some of these as a jig block, and that just kind of cranks down quickly. There's also this style, which is a quick release style, but these are nice to have for again doing the same cuts over and over. We're going to go over to this radial arm saw. So this radial arm saw, this antique of a radial arm saw, doesn't get used that often, but we've got the space, so we went ahead and just put it in. And what we've got in here, Shamika, can you get close to here, is a stacked dado head cutter. So there are 2 blades, and then there are other blades in between those blades. So this is really nice for dado cuts, which is cutting notches. And we've got this set, so it's cutting a notch that is 3/4 of an inch wide. So we can do things like doing these half lap joints. We use this a lot for when we are doing muttons and mullions in windows, like back there, or just kind of put that together. So it makes for a really strong joint for when you've got little pieces of wood. Because if you're doing tons of stuff like that, you don't want to try to nail tiny little pieces together like that. But what you can do is just put these together and tack them together. It's really nice. Again, that's a lot of blade right there. So it's really going to want to run at you. So Mike said it, as you are pulling, you are also resisting to make sure that is not going to run you over. Definitely use the dust collector on this because it's going to make it a big mess because it's clearing out a lot of material at once. Another good example, Shamika, I'm going to get you to swing around right behind you, actually. Sorry, should have warned you. So another example of using the dado cuts, something that we do quite a bit, is these ship's ladders. So it's just, again, a quick, very secure way of making a ladder backstage to get up to a platform. So again, just kind of setting that angle up against the fence and then just clearing it out. And it's 2 passes to get a piece that's to fit something that's 1.5 inches thick. The dados in there are 1/8 of an inch thick, so you can set it, but we use 1x all the time. We just kind of keep the dado set for 3/4 of an inch. What else are we going to talk about? I think
That's about it.
I think that's about it.
That's pretty good.
So we've got the 2 chop saws, and both of these actually will separate from the table in case we need to take something over into the theater. So it's nice to be able to have this set up, but then that one can leave and go somewhere else if we need to, if we're doing lots of cuts or if we're going to be bumping into each other. But having options is good, so we can have 2 people kind of cutting at the same time because they're separated far enough. And again, the dust collector running throughout here is a great thing. And just turn it on real quick. You can see right back there. Having the dust collector setup for this, for all these, is just a great thing. What other safety concerns do we have? The big thing is making sure you have guards on here, making sure you are not putting your arm in a path that can get run over. So always staying on one side or the other. Definitely safety glasses. This is kicking up a lot of debris.
Hearing protection if you're using it for longer periods of time.
Hearing protection, especially for the radial arm saw.
Yeah, don't ever cross your arms in front of the blade, especially with the miter saws. If you're cutting with your right hand and your material's on the right hand side, don't ever cross your arm across the blade.
Yep.
Just use your other hand to cut with and hold with your right hand.
Yep. Making sure that your work is secure. So if you are getting close to the blade and you don't want to put your hand there, you can use some of these hold downs to hold on to the work so you're not getting your hand too close. Also, it's spinning like a wheel. Sometimes it will take something and throw it. So try to make sure things are not going to get thrown around, that you're holding this securely. Never just leave a piece of wood just sitting all by itself and cut it, because it could grab it and throw it. Make sure that is secure, either with your hand or with a clamp.
That's about it. If there are any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We have a couple more minutes. We can answer whatever questions.
We're going to do another slideshow, looking at some of the, oh, do I see a question? Use the word antique. What are the ages of these saws? You know, I'm not sure exactly how old this saw is. I'm going to say it's probably 60s, 70s. This saw is about 20 years old. And then these saws are probably, let's say, about 6 years old. So these radial arm saws, again, there's not a whole lot to them. They'll last forever, just like that one has lasted forever. It's actually still in pretty good shape. So, you know, is for its age, it's hard to kill a good radial arm saw. Some of the controls for this one, the controls are up front, whereas this one, the on-off is off to the side. Normally, this one is mounted to the frame, but with this table here, what we did is we mounted the switch to the table. So it's easy to be able to get to your controls. This one, the controls are pretty similar. You've got this, which will control the up, down. You've got your bevel there, and everything else kind of does the same kind of thing. Sorry, miter there, bevel here. Yep, please throw any more questions in there. So I am going to share screen again and look at some of our shows that we've done in the past. So this was Bright Star. This was a good example of lots of ripping of pieces of wood. All this up here in the trees and the clouds is all ripped. And this down here, the mountains, the next picture you can see a little bit closer. Lots of pieces of wood ripped. And then all of these pieces that were here were cut on the miter saw. So good example of both the saws getting a lot of work. This was Fiddler in the Roof. This was because we were nervous about the amount of weight this was. This was all foam. to make sure that it stayed really light. So this was ripping a lot of foam through the table saw, which I said is not always the funnest thing. Because if it does get off a little bit, the foam will show that damage easily. It will kind of tear it up real quick. This was cabaret. So Mike was ripping tons of little pieces of wood to make the old plaster. This was ragtime. Mike spent a lot of time ripping lots of lumber and making lots and lots of these windows. So we've got the pieces on the inside doing the cross lap, and then on the outside of the frame too. So it kind of notched into the rest of the frame. So that was many hours of work right there. This was Beowulf. The boards all on the back, that was throughout the whole show. So that was a lot of plywood that was ripped to get that paneling. And I think that was it. So again, the table saw and the chop saw get a lot of work every day, all day. Next how-to for us, we are going to be doing pneumatics and building flats.
Yeah.
So Kevin, if you swing over that way, we have tons of flats in the shop that we use over and over, kind of stacked up in the corner back there. So we're going to be talking about hard covered flats, soft covered flats, and using pneumatics. And putting all that stuff together. So there's a really good example again of a table saw. So we're ripping down that lumber to be the size that we need for our flats.
Yeah. So next week is the do part of table saws and chop saws. So if you're interested in coming in as a student, go ahead and sign up online.
Shall we call it?
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.